Hi, Founder fans. Jason here. Welcome to Founder of the Day Week in Review. Everyone popping in the chat. Hi, Jesse, TJ, Nick. So far, I see you guys there. Thank you so much for coming for our live wrap-up of the last 7 founders I've written about and published on my website, founderoftheday.com, and we're wrapping them up here. Everyone, if you have any questions along the way, feel free to shout them out. I will happily answer. I do want to note, I've started shooting these wrap-ups. Essentially, I'm going to shoot them as if they're 7 full videos. So I do this for a few reasons. First of all, so we can just get right through the founder. I can get a nice clean shot because I do clip them out and put them out throughout the week for people who don't have an hour to spend with us on Thursdays. And also that way I don't interrupt the story, but once I get through, after I finish reading through the story, I'll be happy to answer your questions. If I backtrack or go a little off topic, that's absolutely fine. I really appreciate you guys coming. If you want to hit like, that is the nicest thing you could do for me. It makes my day. So thank you again. Let's start chatting about the American Revolution, shall we? Okay, our first founder isn't even a founder. Every Friday, I publish an article about an anti-federalist paper, and we are on the 3rd installment of the impartial examiner. I always want to say in, but apparently it's im, or have I been spelling that wrong for weeks? Anyway, let's do it. Okay. Hi, Founder fans, Jason here, and today's Anti-Federalist is the Impartial Examiner, essay number 3. Now, as we've discussed before, the Impartial Examiner can be a little bit wordy with their discussions, but they're down in Virginia talking about all the reasons the Constitution is terrible and it shouldn't be ratified. Now, what stands out about the 3rd installment of the Impartial Examiner, which was published March 5th, 1788, what makes it unique is that it's written to the general public. See, when you're reading the Impartial Examiners, which again are quite lengthy and pretty, how do you say, they're very interested in showing how intelligent they are with their lengthy words. But usually most anti-federalist papers are directed at the people who are actually going to the conventions. The men, the delegates who will be there to either ratify or not ratify. But number 3 spends a good portion of time talking directly to the general public, saying, hey, pay attention to who you're electing to these conventions. It matters. He does go on to say it should be someone who's going to vote against ratification of the Constitution. But I do want to note, at the very beginning of this, he actually says he wants to demonstrate, he realizes the delegates to the Constitutional Convention themselves are very important people, even in their day. In fact, he applauds the work of, quote, the magnanimous hero who has conducted our armies. Now, the magnanimous hero who has conducted our armies is clearly George Washington. And one of the troubles the Anti-Federalists had was, well, if you're talking bad about the Constitution, people could pretty easily say, hey, what, you don't like George Washington? Which in 1788 was not an acceptable answer. So therefore, he kind of outlines, I'm actually surprised he waited till the 3rd installment of the Impartial Examiner to actually say, oh, no, George Washington's a hero, but he also says George Washington is a human being, and humans are subject to error, especially when they're in a room full of 50 other people, and they're deciding on a new government for eternity. And therefore, he says, yeah, okay, George Washington's great and all, but maybe he's made a mistake. We'll let it slide, of course, but maybe we should, as he said in earlier essays, that we should not necessarily just go out and accept it really quick because Washington said so. And again, I want to repeat, he spends a huge portion of this trying to get the people themselves to choose the right delegates. I will also want to reiterate, it is very wordy and it is much longer than it has to be, as all the Impartial Examiners I have found out are. Now, I do want to note, the Impartial Examiner, who is again anonymous, we don't know who it actually is. He does list a few complaints, but they are pretty much retreading standard anti-federalist fare. The supremacy clause of the Constitution, he notes, could be very dangerous. You know, anything necessary and proper. What does that mean? Anything can be necessary and proper. The idea that there's no regulations on how much taxes can be raised, and the fact that this is the supreme government can raise whatever taxes, can put people in a terrible situation, yada, yada, yada. Again, we've covered most anti-federalists in the past. We are going to continue covering anti-federalist problems in the future, and he basically covers issues you usually have. But the real meat and bones of the third installment of Impartial Examiner number 3 is a direct plea to the people to ignore the fact that George Washington was at the Constitutional Convention and elect delegates to the Virginia Ratification Convention that will vote against the United States Constitution. I hope you enjoyed this video. For those of you watching, thank you so much. Make sure you hit like and subscribe if you're new here. Talk about American Revolution all week long. For those of you watching live, any questions, I will be happy to respond to. Thank you so much for coming. Well, now that we've gotten through the Impartial Examiner, which I say there's 7 founders a week, there's really only 6. I am, I guess, a liar and a fraud. It was 7 at first, and then I did the Federalist Papers for a year and a half, and now we're doing the Anti-Federalist Papers, but whatever, come at me. I'm going to take a quick sip of water. We're going to talk about Richard Hawley. Richard Hawley. Okay, so excuse me. Let's go. Hi, Founder fans. Jason here, and today's founder is Richard Hawley, a governor of Georgia. Now, Richard Hawley was a young, small-town lawyer who was just trying to grow his business when the American Revolution broke out. When it did, however, Hawley tried to stay out of the war, but Georgia was a very particular place during the American Revolution. First of all, it was not very populated at all. The numbers I've heard is about 30,000 people, which is a very small city in modern America, would take up all of Georgia. Those people, a huge portion of them were loyalists, which is why they didn't send anyone to the First Continental Congress, and even the revolutionaries themselves had 2 very divided parties, where, Button Gwinnett, the leader of one party, would be killed in a duel by Lachlan McIntosh, the leader of another party. So this is the situation that we find Richard Hawley in. Like I said, he tries to stay out of the war, though he does basically side with the Patriots. Then when the British finally invade Savannah, Hawley takes his family and flees. They go to the state capital of Augusta, and this is where he becomes really friendly with George Walton, who himself was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. And in this radical time of Georgian politics, he joins with Walton, who was one of the radicals. And suddenly he finds himself in a situation where the government itself has been relocated, the state is in disarray, essentially, for all intents and purposes, under British control. But he becomes friendly with the right people and suddenly is a leader in the small amount of patriots that actually exist in Georgia. Now, George Walton leaves for the Continental Congress, and therefore the governorship is essentially vacant. Hawley is elected himself as governor of Georgia, as basically a dark horse candidate, fairly out of nowhere. Then again, the Redcoats come back, keep invading the area, and Hawley also runs from the state. He is essentially a governor in exile. But what he does when he runs away from Georgia is he takes the state archives. And this is, from my perspective, Hawley's great contribution to the American Revolution. He takes the state archives of Georgia while he is a governor fleeing into exile, and he saves them. He brings them to North Carolina, where they become safe. And first of all, they were an important resource at the time to understand both the young state of Georgia's financial situation and legal situation, but also many of the colonial records were involved, which were important in the transition to a new government. Additionally, we now get to be as students of history. We can learn tons about revolutionary Georgia from these papers. So we owe Richard Hawley a great deal of gratitude for that. And side note, this is not an image of Richard Hawley. This is just a guy on horseback. It might be a picture of Paul Revere, I'm not sure. But no known image of Richard Hawley. Anyway, Hawley then goes back. He is elected to the Continental Congress for a brief time. He spends about 2 years in Philadelphia. He's there while they're working out the Treaty of Paris, and then he returns to Georgia. He was really concerned with making sure that Georgia remained independent. As I said, Georgia was heavily loyalist, and it was late to the game with the Revolutionary War, and it had been conquered fairly early, about halfway through the war, but easily taken by the British. And while they were signing the Treaty of Paris, Hawley and several other delegates to the Continental Congress representing Georgia were afraid that in the negotiations, the Americans would just say, I'll tell you what, you keep Canada, you want Florida, why don't you take Georgia? We don't need Georgia. There's very little people there. And Hawley was very afraid of this, and I guess rightfully so. And he and his colleagues successfully included Georgia. Truthfully, it seems like the 13 colonies were, or now states, were going to go together no matter what, but it was not as, it was in question. There was even a question, I know William Henry Drayton from South Carolina was trying to absorb Georgia into South Carolina. So there were questions if Georgia was going to be its own state or not after independence. And Hawley was present for a lot of these important discussions at the end of the war. Now, he returns home, and there's a vacancy in Chief Justice of the state of Georgia. And who better but Richard Hawley, this formerly Dark Horse governor, who comes back home from the Continental Congress and becomes Chief Justice of Georgia. He spends several years as Chief Justice of Georgia. What's also interesting about Hawley is he's one of the few Catholic founders of the United States. Maryland had a pretty heavily Catholic heavily Catholic population comparatively, but Georgia really didn't. But Hawley was one of the few Catholics to serve in the American Revolution. I should always bring that up. Now, he had a strong desire to receive the sacraments and communion, but there was not a lot of places to receive this, especially when he was getting older and getting ill. So when the war ended, he actually goes to Florida, which was now British, but had for a long time had been Spanish. And because of that, there was still a good amount of, there was the ability to receive your sacraments and communion in Florida, which was a lot closer to Georgia than it was to Maryland, for example. Now, he goes to Catholic, he does get these sacraments, and then he begins to return home to Georgia, but unfortunately, he passed away almost as soon as he arrives back home. Now, I was unable to determine exactly what ailment it was that killed him. I know that, he did live in Georgia, but even Florida was very hard to live in at the time. Malaria and other diseases made it very inhospitable. So he does return to Georgia, but right when he gets back, he dies. And he dies as Chief Justice of Georgia, and he's only 44 years old, which is, again, pretty young by my standards. So Richard Hawley escaped with the state archives, a governor who fled for his life, ends up being Chief Justice. A really important guy to the young state of Georgia, which doesn't get a lot of play because there wasn't that many people there. So I hope you learned a little bit about Richard Hawley and Revolutionary Georgia. If you did, hit like. If you're new here, hit subscribe for American Revolution content all week long. I do see a question coming in. Would you say Georgia was leaning more towards Federalist or Anti-Federalist during the debates? Georgia is Federalist. One of the reasons the Loyalists like Britain is because it was the most powerful empire in the world. And one of the things that Hamilton and Madison were trying to do with the Constitution was build a powerful nation. Also, Georgia is either the third or fourth state to ratify. Georgia ratifies like right away, and I don't even know if there was one no vote. I'm pretty sure Georgia voted. I don't want to say, I don't remember all the election. There's 13 different ratification debates. I don't remember all of the votes exactly, but I do know Georgia ratified right away, 1777. While the Anti-Federalist papers we were talking about just earlier were from 1787, the following, 1788, the following year. Georgia ratifies within like 2 or 3 months of the Constitution being written. So Georgia becomes pretty Federalist pretty quick. Also, going for Georgia, as I said, it was so sparsely populated that it would be hard for them to defend themselves. Additionally, there were not, I mean, no, I should call them wars. There were wars between states back when they were colonies and even afterward. I mean, as soon as the Revolutionary War ends, there's like, I think there were 3 or 4 Yankee Pennamite Wars, it's called. What we now know as northeastern Pennsylvania, Connecticut thought was Connecticut. And before, during, and even after the Revolutionary War, there were actual battles that took place in what is called the Wyoming Valley in northeastern Pennsylvania between people from Connecticut and people from Pennsylvania, both of whom thought they owned. Both states thought they owned the property, and therefore the people thought they owned the land that they purchased from their individual states. And as I said earlier, South Carolina could easily have conquered Georgia. And William Henry Drayton was one of many people who were trying to get Georgia to be annexed by South Carolina. William Henry Drayton goes down to Georgia and speaks in front of the Georgia Assembly in, like, I think it was 78, like during the war, and says, hey, why don't you just become part of South Carolina? It'll be great. And he actually gets kicked out of Georgia. The governor says he will be arrested if he stays in Georgia and has to go. I don't think it was Howley was governor at the time. I think it was before Howley was governor. It might have been Walton. I don't remember which governor said that, but he was essentially kicked out of Georgia. So I hope that answers your question. I'm under the impression that most people from Georgia Georgia's pretty federalist. Although, like many southern states, they would end up becoming Jeffersonian. Democratic Republicans, as they were first called, anti-administration, Jeffersonian Democrats, right off the bat. But once the question of federal government, they were definitely for. Would you say Richard Halley had a big say if Georgia and delegates to vote yes on the Declaration of Independence? And also, did he have any say on the ratification of the Constitution in Georgia? Good questions. As for the Declaration of Independence, no. Like I said, he kind of comes in a little bit later into the game. It's really not until the capture of Savannah that Howley even finds himself participating in politics. I probably should have made that more clear earlier. Georgia was heavily loyalist, and the Patriots themselves were divided, which means most citizens of Georgia kept quiet to their loyalties and tried to stay out of it. And Howley seems to have been not super quiet, which is why he ran away when the British showed up, but not very active participant. And so by the time he actually gets involved in politics, the Declaration's already been signed. Or at least, statewide politics. The Declaration's already been signed. So he's really not involved with that at all. As for the Constitution, no, I believe he's passed away by that point. I don't remember the exact date of his death, but I believe he dies. You know what? Let me double check. We can look it up pretty quick. I got the internet right here. Richard Howley. I don't remember reading. Excuse me. I don't remember. Yeah, December 1784. So he dies 3 years before the Constitution's even written. So, no, he has nothing to do with either one. His time in the Revolution is very, very brief. It's only about 4 years he's participating. 5 years he's actually participating, and he gets a lot done in those 5 years, as we've seen. Thank you for your questions. Feel free to ask more. I'm going to pop up, though, our next founder today, John Lansing, and this is going to be fun. John Lansing is a lot of fun. Excuse me. All right. Let's do John Lansing. I'll answer any more. I'm going to run through his life, and I'll answer whatever questions you have about Howley or Lansing once I get through it. So thank you so much, guys. Let's do it. Hi, founder fans. Jason here, and today's founder is John Lansing. Now, John Lansing was a young man from New York when the Revolutionary War broke out. He had studied law under Robert Yates, which becomes important later, and he goes on to start a pretty successful law firm. Except almost immediately, he starts this law firm, and as I said, the Revolutionary War breaks out, and he starts a firm and almost immediately leaves to join the Continental Army. And he serves as an aide-de-camp for General Philip Schuyler. he is working directly with Philip Schuyler, and Schuyler was the number 3 highest ranking general in the Continental Army, or no, maybe 4. They changed positions a lot, but it was George Washington, Artemus Ward, Charles Lee, and then Philip Schuyler. Because New York was so important, they needed one of the highest ranking major generals in the army to be from New York. And even though he wasn't really an army man or soldier, lifetime soldier, Schuyler always participated in the militia and things of that nature, and he was one of the most important who negotiated with Native American tribes, and that was a very key position in New York. And Lansing finds himself right in this circle, controlling the Northern Army and negotiating with Native Americans and almost participating in the invasion of Canada, except he's only there for a few months when he receives election to the New York State Assembly. The provincial assembly, as it was called at the time. And he was just 26 years old. And this starts a lifetime of really important politics. Now, Lansing spends most of the war in state politics, overseeing New York State and its transition from colony to state. And he even becomes Speaker of the House for 2 years. And furthermore, he gets elected mayor of Albany. So Albany at this point, I know nowadays Albany, New York is not the biggest city in the world. It's kind of known as a corrupt capital. At the time, Albany was one of the bigger cities in the young United States. And it was not yet capital of New York, but it was extraordinarily important. And as mayor of Albany, this is a great position. Now, he does take a year. He goes to the Confederation Congress, as the Continental Congress was called, when people, after the Articles of Confederation were signed. And in the Continental Congress, he becomes friendly with a few young men, Alexander Hamilton and James Madison. And they're all complaining about how terrible the Articles of Confederation are. But Lansing goes home, he becomes mayor again, works in the state assembly again for a few years, and then there's a convention called in Philadelphia. Now, we know this convention today as the Constitutional Convention. They knew it as the Philadelphia Convention, and Lansing is one of 3 men from New York sent to this Constitutional Convention. He's sent with Robert Yates, who I said before was his mentor and taught him law in the first place, and one of the towering figures in New York politics, and a young Alexander Hamilton. And these 3 men go down, and almost right away, Virginia presents the idea that, oh, we're going to write a whole new federal government here. And Lansing said, no, we were only supposed to be here to amend the Articles of Confederation. And that's what the New York instructions said. And we need to keep in mind that the delegates to the Continental Congress and the Constitutional Convention, they were very attached to their instructions. They were not representing themselves, and they weren't even representing the people. They were representing their states. Their states sent them to represent the state government and gave them very specific instructions as to what the state wanted. What the state said is you could amend the Articles of Confederation, but the state said nothing, the instructions said nothing about writing a new government. And after only about 6 weeks, both John Lansing and Robert Yates end up leaving the Constitutional Convention because this is too much. It is not what we were sent here to do. If we improve it, if these men were to ratify the Constitution, they thought they could be arrested for breaking the rules, for essentially committing treason for the independent nation that was New York. Because, yes, under the Articles of Confederation, each state was a separate nation. They were different countries. They just had a firm league of friendship. And now they were turning all these separate countries into one country. And that is not what their instructions said. So Lansing does decide to leave the Constitutional Convention. A side note, that's why when you see the signers of the Constitution, it says, and Mr. Hamilton of New York, because the rest of New York's delegates left and said, New York said we can't do this. And it's kind of like a cover your butt situation by Mr. Hamilton to say, and Mr. Hamilton of New York. Either way, Lansing goes back, becomes a pretty important anti-federalist, and is really one of the people who helps make the vote in New York extraordinarily close. In fact, one of the reasons the Federalist Papers are written in New York is because John Lansing and his friend Robert Yates and their other friend Melancton Smith and their other friend Governor George Clinton are all very actively opposing the Constitution. And in an effort to counter that and get the Constitution ratified by New York, that's why Madison and Hamilton go back to New York and write the Federalist Papers there. Although I will say, the Continental Congress was meeting there, and that's why Madison was also there, and Hamilton was from there. So, to be fair, don't call me out on that. Either way, John Lansing, despite opposing the federal government, is still really respected. I should note that the New York's Ratification Convention only ratifies the Constitution 30 to 27. 30 to 27. That is 3 votes, which means if 2 people change their mind, New York does not ratify the Constitution. Now, Lansing does leave the state assembly for a while. He continues as mayor of Albany for a little bit. But in 1790, just after this, you'd think it might have hurt his career, but no, just after this, he's actually chosen to sit on the New York Supreme Court as an associate justice. After 8 years, he's actually promoted to Chief Justice of the New York State Supreme Court. After that, he actually is given the position of Chancellor. Now, we don't have the position of Chancellor anymore. I don't want to get too into the weeds of it, but technically, Chancellor was a higher judicial position than Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court had many people and Chancellor was just you. But the difference is what the types of cases they decided. Now, so Lansing ends up taking over for Robert Livingston, who had been Chancellor since the beginning of the Revolution. Livingston goes to France to buy Louisiana, and John Lansing becomes, again, the highest justice in New York. Now, he holds this for about a decade and a half, and then retires at 60 years old. When he's 60 years old, he's in a hotel in New York City doing some work. He leaves the hotel to go mail a letter, and then he vanishes. Poof. Gone. I should update. He retired at 60. He was about 75 when he goes to mail the letter. Poof. Gone. It is one of the great mysterious disappearances in the history of New York City. He is one of the most famous lawmen, and by lawmen I mean justices, lawmakers, judges in the history of New York State, and he just disappears. Now, we don't know what happened. It has never been solved. There are some ideas. The most likely candidate for where he went, from what I understand, is that he probably fell off a dock and drowned. They were old-timey docks. You could trip on him. He was an older man at this point. He probably fell off a dock and drowned. I do want to note, there was a publication in 1882, because he dies. He lives a long time. He was young during the Revolution, so his death is in the his disappearance is in the 1830s. Okay, so like Andrew Jackson's president by the time he dies. 50 years after that, there was a publication that claims he was murdered by several businessmen who wanted him out of the way. But he was kind of looks out for the people. As far as the wealthy elite in New York City went in the early 1800s, he looked out for the people at large, and there were several businessmen who he did not help. We'll put it like that. And there is this accusation that these businessmen wanted him out of the way and may have murdered him. To be fair, this seems very unlikely because he was retired. He held no real power other than the respect of people at the time. So this seems unlikely. Unfortunately, we will never know the fate of John Lansing, a Chief Justice and Chancellor of New York State, who walked out of the Constitutional Convention because he did not like what they were saying. I hope you learned something about John Lansing today. If you did, definitely hit like. If you're new here, subscribe. I put out videos about the American Revolution all week long. So hit like and subscribe. And Fridays we play trivia, so come for that. Sorry, every episode one of the cats has to open the door. So if you hear some creaking, there was some hissing this time too. They weren't being happy with each other. Nick, woe is right. I see you there. I'm taking a sip of water. We'll pull up our next founder. We'll keep it rolling. Keep this train rolling. John Fitch. Okay. Excuse me. Allergies. We're talking about Steam. Now, we've talked about Steam several times in the last few weeks. We had the dudes from Steam Patriots on. And then just a few days ago, I did another episode just on steam power during the Revolutionary War because of this. I forgot to put the link in the description now that I'm saying it out loud. So link not the description, but it is recently on the channel if you want to find it. I'm not going to go too deep into what I call the steam wars. I will mention them briefly here. This time I'm going to focus mostly on the life of Fitch, because he is a fascinating character. He is, just plain and simple, a fascinating guy. So, let's get into it. Hi Founder fans, Jason here, and today's founder is John Fitch, the man who drove the first steamboat in front of the delegates to the Constitutional Convention. So, John Fitch, when the American Revolution broke out, he was living in New Jersey. Before he lived in New Jersey, he was from Connecticut, and he had gotten married there and had one kid, and his wife was pregnant with a second kid, and then he kind of left the family. So, gets a little bit of, you know, a little bit who this guy is. Now, he writes an autobiography later and claims that his wife was just unbearable, so, you know, he left his kids behind. Fine. That's neither here nor there. That's just how he gets to New Jersey, because he goes to New Jersey and he opens up a gold and silver smithing shop where he's working with metals. Now, he does briefly join the American Revolution. I want to note here that there is a John Fitch who acts as a deputy commissary general for the Eastern region. I could not confirm that this was the same person, and I don't believe it is. I did see certain places on the internet saying they were the same person, but I just don't, I see no connection between this kind of regular guy and someone who held a fairly high position in the Continental Army. Though, there are signs that indicate he did donate beer and other items to the American Revolution, specifically the Continental Army. But his participation in the war in the early years seems to be with the New Jersey militia. And most of his work was as a gun repairman. I forget the old-timey term. A gunsmith, there it is. Fixing weapons for the New Jersey militia. So he does support the Patriots, and he does help the war effort in his own way, though he doesn't ever really seem to take the field. And again, I do not believe he is the same person who actually acted as a deputy commissary general. That being said, the British come through New Jersey during the Forage Wars, and they destroy his workshop. So he runs away, and he goes out to Kentucky. He needs to find something to do, and he ends up being a surveyor for several years. He ends up getting himself a good amount of land as a reward for his survey work. I did also read, but I could not confirm, that he was captured by the British and taken to Fort Detroit, and then eventually released. That story also seems a little suspect to me, but I can't deny it. I did want to throw it out here. What we do know about John Fitch is when he starts building his steamboats and his steam engines. Now, the British, as I said recently in a video, the British had steam power, and they were keeping it very secret. But word got out, and somehow this regular guy learns about steam power, though he never would have had access to any instructions to build it himself. He must have been pretty smart, because he does start building some steam engines. He moves just outside Philadelphia, builds himself a steamboat. He works with another gentleman who helps him get it on a boat, and the first time they display it is on the Philadelphia River. The name of the boat is the Perseverance, and on August 26th, 1787, a huge chunk of Philadelphia comes out to the water, including most delegates to the Constitutional Convention. And they see this dude turn on his steamboat and power it through. He moves at a whopping 3 miles an hour, which sounds paltry today, but at the time, the idea that the boat was moving itself in this nature was mind-boggling. Now, Fitch wants to make money with his invention, as inventors are wont to do, but at the time, patents did not work the way they work now, and he had the opportunity to get monopolies. And first he went to the Continental Congress and tried to get a monopoly in America, and the Continental Congress, under the Articles of Confederation, said, we don't have that power. We also don't have any money for you, so get out of here. We don't even have money to pay our troops. We have no money. Get out of here. And he does. He goes to Virginia. He actually meets with George Washington. I should note, on his way down, he meets with someone in Maryland. The name is eluding me right now, but he met with the sitting governor of Maryland, who became a friend of his, and said, hey, someone else has a boat too. a gentleman, James Ramsay, who ends up being his lifelong rival. And it turns out he would learn at this time that Fitch was one of 4 people building steamboats. This will come into play in a minute. But he goes down, he actually meets with George Washington at Mount Vernon, who is supporter of his soon-to-be enemy Ramsay and doesn't tell Fitch everything that's going on necessarily. He meets with James Madison, who is essentially running the government of Virginia. Virginia does end up awarding him some money. Several states award him money, and the idea that he could have a monopoly should his boat be more successfully built. Unfortunately for him, this never happens. In fact, he ends up going and being a part of the Steam Wars. As I said in my video the other day, the patent office in the United States was created essentially because of all these people claiming steam power, boats specifically, but powering other things also. And the fact that we have now, 2 different types of magic phones, this Apple phones and Android phones, they're basically the same thing, but with a little bit of difference in there. And that little bit of difference means they get different patents. And the way they settled which one of these 4 people with steamboats gets a patent is they said they'll all get a patent because their boats are a little bit different. And we're still there today. Like I said, iPhones still follow these same rules because of this. Largely majority of percentage due to the steamboats and John Fitch. Now, Fitch is not happy about this because this is about a decade after he built his first steamboat or started building steamboats. And he is now not being rewarded for a lot of hard work and a lot of money, his own money, that he dumped in over the years. He also got investors from time to time here or there who dumped money in, and now it seemed like, it was all for naught. He is so insulted. He actually writes a letter to Thomas Jefferson that he doesn't send. He ends up not sending it. It's found in his notes. But he writes a letter to Thomas Jefferson, like, if he had sent it, it's the type of letter that Thomas Jefferson would probably have had to challenge him to a duel. Now, of all the things Thomas Jefferson is or isn't, he didn't fight in any duels. He's kind of a wuss in that nature. Not that I'm saying people who don't fight duels are wusses, because I know for a fact none of you have fought a duel, because there hasn't been a duel in the United States in a very long time. At least none that has made the news. Either way, he doesn't send it. He ends up moving out to his property in Kentucky and takes to drink because his career is done. He's spent all his money. He ends up drinking really heavily and essentially ruins his life, and he dies just to... I did skip one part. Before he goes to Kentucky, he goes to France to try and raise money over there, but the Reign of Terror isn't giving out any money. And then he goes to Britain, who's like, you stole our idea, get out! And he does. He gets out, he goes to Kentucky, he starts drinking heavily, and dies just a few years later from drinking heavily. Now, what's really extraordinary about John Fitch, again, he built this machine just on his own. His only experience was as a silversmith and goldsmith, so he could work with metals, but he had no idea how to build a steam, and he just did. He passes away during the John Adams administration, and 50 years later, his granddaughter goes up to the attic and finds a design for an engine. Now, that engine had not been built at that point, but in the 1950s, the design was reviewed, and the conclusion was drawn by 1950s modern scientists that this is a design for an engine that was supposed to run on rails. And this gentleman, before anyone else in the world, had essentially designed a steam engine for a train. And we all know how important steam trains became in the mid and late 19th century and into the 20th century. Trains were extraordinarily important and honestly still are very important at transporting goods. We might not think of it as much, but so John Fitch, one of the most underrated inventors, not only of the American Revolution, but arguably of American history. So I hope you learned a little bit about John Fitch, a little more about steam power in the Revolution. If you did, definitely hit like. And if you're new here, subscribe. I put out videos all week long about the American Revolution. Thank you for watching. You guys have any TJ? I see you laughing at that. It's the whole thing is fascinating to me. So. Oh, dude, I ran into a lot of great stories this week. Elijah Perkins. Oh, let's do it. Oh, this is gonna be fun. Okie dokie. Again, any questions? I might ignore them at first so I can get through the story, but I'll be happy to answer them as we go. So let's talk about Elisha Perkins. I think it's Elisha. It might be Elisha, but I don't know who to ask. So I'm gonna call him Elisha. All right. Hi, Founder fans. Jason here, and today's founder is Elisha Perkins, whose disease-curing invention was essentially snake oil, but it led to some magnificent scientific discoveries. Let's get into it. Elisha Perkins' father founded the Connecticut Medical Society, and Perkins followed in his father's footsteps and became a doctor himself. During the Revolutionary War, Perkins actually served as a surgeon in the Continental Army. He was assisting wounded soldiers as early as the siege of Boston. Now, after the war ended, Perkins went to his medical practice and spent about 15 years just practicing medical in private, but he had a few ideas that he thought were very clever, and he came up with, in the mid-1790s, what was called the metallic tractor. Now, these metallic tractors were said to cure absolutely everything. They were two rods. One was made of brass, one was made of iron, and they were basically the size and shape of a pencil. And this is actually an image, a cartoon making fun of it next to me, where they would rub the brass one on your wound, and then they'd rub the iron one on your wound, and poof, your wound is healed, or your disease is cured. And it would cure gout and inflammation, back pain, just the longest list. Probably shouldn't have used the term wound. It wouldn't heal like an open wound, but many ailments it would just cure. It was amazing. He even had people like George Washington and Chief Justice John Ellsworth both met this man and supported what he was doing. He would make a fortune selling them across the United States and even into Europe. Even though they cost essentially a month's salary for your average person, people would buy them because they would get healed of so many diseases. It was miraculous, right? Well, why don't we use it today? Well, because it wasn't that miraculous. In fact, Elisha Perkins had critics right away. As soon as he started promoting this, many doctors in the medical field were like, what are you talking about? In fact, the Connecticut Medical Society, the exact organization his father started, kicked him out because his experiments were incomplete. There was nothing proving this worked. But he was making money. In fact, he sent his son Benjamin to Europe and was the one selling it over to Europe. He became an overnight success. Now, Perkins, riding the wave, decided, well, I have another cure. We are going to get back to the tractors, but let's finish Perkins' life first. He says, you know what else is terrible? Smallpox. And it was. Smallpox was the scourge of 18th century America. And Perkins decides, well, I'm going to cure smallpox. So he comes up with an antiseptic, which consisted of vinegar, salt, and water. Now, unlike his first invention, this one didn't work, because as soon as he came up with this idea, there was an outbreak in New York City, a pretty terrible outbreak of smallpox in New York City. So Perkins goes there, catches smallpox, and dies pretty much right away. Because, well, vinegar, salt, and water did not cure smallpox, still probably don't. But what's really fascinating about the story of Elisha Perkins is not his life, but the fallout from it. See, there was a London physician named John Haygarth, who, side note, had done work to actually reduce the spread and mortality rate of smallpox. He didn't know what was going on with these metal tractors that Perkins had made so much money selling. Why were they working? It doesn't make sense. You're just rubbing iron and brass on and it heals it somehow? That doesn't make any sense. So he had an idea. He built 2 tractors of his own made out of wood. But he designed them to look and feel exactly like the brass and metal ones. And then he went and used his fake metal tractors on patients. And what do you know? Those patients also felt better. And after several years of study, Haygarth publishes a book called On the Imagination as a Cause and as a Cure of Disease of the Body. And this book is the first one to discuss what we now call the placebo effect. The idea that if you think you're being treated, even if you're not, your mind can actually help heal you of diseases and ease your pain because you think you're being treated and cured. So Elisha Perkins, his snake oil that was his metal tractors end up leading to the study of and the creation of the idea of the placebo effect, which we now know is pretty common. It's in TV shows all the time. And not only the placebo effect itself, but it's led to 200 years of study of how the brain affects diseases, how the brain affects not just the ailment, but the pains themselves, the symptoms themselves. A lot of this can actually be traced back to the sneaky invention of Elisha Perkins. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, definitely hit like. If you're new here, subscribe for a new founder all week long, and trivia on Friday. So definitely come for that. Thank you so much. TJ, Elijah Perkins is fascinating. Like I said, he's like friendly with George Washington. Not friendly with, but George Washington really respects what he's doing, because like he's doing it and it is helping people. That's the crazy thing, and that's what Hagar studies. Is like, how is it helping people? There's no science behind this. Two more founders. Yes, this is a fun week. We found there are some fun founders this day. Excuse me. Allergies. Okay, so we're going to talk about Pierpont Edwards and the Toleration Party. Let's do it. Hi, founder fans. Jason here, and today's founder is Pierpont Edwards and the Toleration Party that he formed. See, Pierpont Edwards graduates from Princeton just as the Revolutionary War is breaking out, and he does join the Army very quickly, but even though he's just 27 years old, he's elected to the state House of Representatives, and he spends most of the next decade and a half in Connecticut's state assembly. Now, during this time, he is actually chosen to Connecticut's ratification convention, and once the Constitution is approved, Pierpont Edwards is sent to the Continental Congress. Now, if the Continental Congress was a boring, pointless job before the Constitution was ratified, the year or so after it was ratified is even more valueless. But it's kind of an honorary title, and it helps him make a little bit of a name for himself. In fact, this is how he becomes known to General George Washington, who is soon elected President George Washington. And President George Washington chooses Pierpont Edwards to be the first United States attorney for Connecticut, which is essentially a federal prosecutor in the state of Connecticut. A pretty important job. Now, he has this for several years. He actually becomes associated with the Democratic Party, even though Connecticut is really heavily Federalist and is like the last Federalist holdout of all the states. He becomes associated with the Democratic Republican Party, mostly because his nephew, Aaron Burr, gets elected Vice President of the United States. Yes, his, Burr comes from the Edwards family. Jonathan Edwards was, I think, his great-grandfather, the famous preacher. Pierpont Edwards was his uncle. And a side note, Pierpont Edwards actually would have a son-in-law named Eli Whitney, whose cotton gin made slavery a lot more profitable for a very long time. I guess we don't blame Pierpont for that, but it's fun to know. Either way, because of his his nephew being vice president, well, President Thomas Jefferson gives Edwards a promotion from federal attorney to federal judge, and he becomes the Justice of the District of Connecticut. Basically the highest ranking federal judge in the state, and he would hold this seat for the rest of his life. But during this time, he decides to start the Toleration Party. So we know that the United States Constitution, well, the First Amendment, guarantees freedom of religion to the people. Essentially, it means there can be no state religion in the federal government. But, and this is shocking to a lot of people, there were already state religions in several states. Connecticut was no different. Connecticut was a congregationalist state, which meant part of your taxes as a citizen that you paid to the state became a tithe to the Congregationalist Church in Connecticut. Now, at this point, we're in the year 1817. We're in the James Monroe administration. We've made it through the War of 1812, and Connecticut still has a state religion. As I said earlier, though, he was a Democratic Republican in a heavily Federalist Connecticut. But after the War of 1812, the disastrous Hartford Convention, the whole blue lights fiasco, the Federalist Party is essentially falling apart, and Pierpont Edwards sees an opening. He creates this Toleration Party, which I just realized I left the word T out of party next to me. I apologize for that. But he creates the Toleration Party, seeing this opening. And what he does is he collects Democratic Republicans, disheartened Federalists, and basically anyone who was not a Congregationalist in Connecticut, and forms them under this one party. The party's platform was twofold. First of all, they wanted to expand the right and vote in Connecticut, make it more inclusive, make it a little more democratic, because Connecticut was pretty elitist at that point. And the second reason was toleration. As I said, part of your taxes would go to the Congregationalist Church. Pierpont Edwards wanted to be able not have his money go to the Congregationalist Church. So Yale is in Connecticut, and that is technically a Congregationalist school, at least at the time. And Edwards was an Episcopalian, and he wanted to open up an Episcopalian college. But the Congregationalist state government of Connecticut said, no, we're only going to give government funds to Yale. Why would we give it to an Episcopalian college? And he said, well, this is terrible. Let's change it. And as an important person, a federal judge, Aaron Burr's uncle, he ends up leading this movement, and this Toleration Party grows and becomes the leading power in Connecticut, and they get elected to the state government. And the first thing they do, they make sweeping changes. First of all, they write a new constitution, and they want this new constitution to have a simple majority vote in the government to make any new legislation, as opposed to a quorum of 2/3, which, when there was mostly Congregationalists, was very hard. But somehow enough people are elected, enough people support this, even Congregationalists, former Federalists who are Congregationalists, who see the contradiction between the ideals of the Revolutionary War and the state church in Connecticut. They end up going for it and passing this new constitution and making it more democratic. And they give more people the right to vote, and they eliminate the state church. And now the state of Connecticut began giving maybe not the same amount of funds, but some funds to both the Congregationalist Yale and other institutions of all denominations. And furthermore, you no longer had your taxes go as a tithe to one particular church. They still collected a tithe, but you could choose which church it went to at that point. It's a huge change. And again, we're talking about almost 50 years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence that this all finally goes through. Now, his Toleration Party would dominate Connecticut politics through the rest of his life. He passes away as an old man in the late 1820s, so not long after this. He has aged over the decades we've just discussed. But when he passes away, he's still a Federalist judge. His Toleration Party disappears, but it becomes essentially the Jacksonian wing of the Democratic Republican Party. And his decisions, this party, the changes made under the authority of Pierpont Edwards, still affect Connecticut very much to this day. So I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit about state religions during the American Revolution, and specifically Pierpont Edwards, who is a fascinating character. If you did, hit like. If you're new here, subscribe for more American Revolution all week long. I do think I saw some comments coming in while we were talking about this. Positive thinking does yes. Yeah, oh yeah, I said that when my spouse was pregnant with our first kid. I was like, listen, like, everything's going to be fine as long as we keep a positive attitude. And it was. I mean, I know that's not 100% the case, you know, but I do think it helps. I think, you know, especially, like, I think it's not American Revolution at all, but responding to your comments, I think stress is really the biggest factor in people's health. Once I was able to kind of make myself a lot more stress-free, I used to be pretty stressed out all the time. Once I was able to, like, I don't know, stop watching the news, which I did about 10 years ago. I started really, like, honing in how much garbage TV I watch, aka what's going on. I started living solely in the 17th century, basically. I was able to breathe easy, and, like, I stopped going to the chiropractor. Do you know what I mean? Like, I could stop going to the chiropractor because I wasn't watching the news all day long. Which we don't talk about modern politics here, and that's one of the reasons why. This is an escape for me. Alright, who's our final founder today? We are looking at Joseph Graham. Joseph Graham is a very interesting character. So let's do that history. All right. Hi, Founder fans. Jason here, and today's founder is Joseph Graham. Joseph Graham is a very interesting character because he was essentially a nobody living on what was then more or less the North Carolina frontier, in and around Charlotte, which today is a city, not frontier. But back in the 18th century, it was frontier. Either way, he ends up joining the Revolutionary War. He joins the local militia at just 19 years old, and he ends up serving in many major battles in, well, I don't want to say major battles, because on the frontier of the Carolinas, it was mostly skirmishes, but he serves in many important skirmishes in that theater of the war. Now, he actually quickly rises from just a regular private to a major, which is impressive for a young man. And at times, he serves temporarily as quartermaster, though again, that is just temporarily. He just steps in when needed, but it indicates his character, that he could be trusted when called upon. So he serves about 3 years in the war, and what's probably most notable about him is his participation in the capture of Charlotte. Now, Charlotte itself was a very small town at that point, but the British had come through, taken Georgia, taken South Carolina. They were coming up through North Carolina. The Battle of Camden had already happened, and the Patriots are essentially shooting and retreating. During the Battle of Charlotte, the capture of Charlotte is usually called. Well, the Patriots are there. They're in the courthouse, and I think it's the Mecklenburg courthouse, and the British send an advance party. They shoot at those guys. They retreat. And then Cornwallis comes in with his army, and the Patriots run. Now, Graham is one of the people asked to cover the retreat. And he does this valiantly, and then is shot 3 times, and then he is bayoneted 6 times, and he's left for dead. And while that could be the end of the story, it's not, because somehow this guy's a survivor, and despite his massive blood loss, he's able to, after everyone leaves, stumble from the field and arrive at a neighbor's house. Fortunately, he was from the area, and the neighbor seems to have known him, and they take several months nursing him back to health. This is, of course, the last time he participates in the war. It took a very long time to be nursed back to health, but once he does, he joins politics and becomes pretty successful. Several times he's elected to the state assembly. However, after about a decade, he leaves politics pretty permanently because he and his brother-in-law start an iron foundry. They become ironmongers, which is just a great name for a career. And as an ironmonger, he earns a tidy fortune. Now, during the War of 1812, this iron foundry ends up producing a great deal of ammunition for the Patriots. Additionally, during the War of 1812, he had been in the militia now since the Revolutionary War. We're going on 40 years of militia service. He is appointed as a brigadier general in the state militia. Now, North Carolina doesn't see a lot of... the militia of North Carolina does not see a lot of action in the War of 1812. Much of the war, though they do, it is a lot of naval battles. A lot is going on in upstate New York and in the north. Not a ton, so I have not been able to find that he actually saw any action at this point. But again, he is a brigadier general in the state militia. He's in charge of protecting North Carolina, and well, North Carolina didn't suffer much damage, so good for Joseph Graham. Anyway, he ends up, at this point he's growing old, he ends up retiring, and he gets upset about the way history of the revolution in North Carolina was being treated, specifically out in the Carolinas. He sees that a lot of the history that's being retold is incorrect, and this is at a time where history is in its infancy as a subject. It would still be decades before people got degrees in universities for history. So people generally would take stories they heard and write it down. It's how we get the George Washington cherry tree story from Mason Weems. He just heard someone say it and wrote it down in a book about Washington, and now it's history, even though it probably never happened. And Graham was upset hearing stories like this as someone who participated in these battles. So in 1825, he's in his 60s, he begins publishing his memories of the war. He would publish them in sections, not as one large book, not a memoir, just little memories. But he accumulated a great deal of them, and because of this, historically, he's considered to be extremely accurate for someone writing at this time where accuracy was not very important. And because of his accuracy with certain battles, we can look at him as telling a fairly truthful account, and a lot of his recollections give us great information about like the Battle of Ramser's Mill, the Battle of McIntyre's Farm, and even the Battle of Kings Mountain. Though the Battle of Kings Mountain is pretty well documented, some of these other ones are fairly minor skirmishes. They're called battles, but they're pretty much minor skirmishes, but we know a lot about them because of Joseph Graham. And that's pretty much the history of Graham. I should note, his son goes on to be a governor of North Carolina. He ends up being a Secretary of the United States Navy, and William Graham, governor of North Carolina, Secretary of the Navy, and he ends up being a senator in both the United States government and the Confederate States government, which, you know, we don't talk about the Civil War here. It's a little out of our wheelhouse, but it's very interesting that he served in both. And, you know, Graham, who, again, was kind of a nobody on the frontier, makes his name to the point where his son William can then go on to hold extremely high positions. So I hope you learned a little bit about Joseph Graham, maybe even Charlotte and the frontier of North Carolina during the American Revolutionary and War of 1812 wars. So thank you for watching. Make sure you hit like, and if you're new here, definitely subscribe for a new founder and more American Revolution just all week long. I did see some comments out of my peripherals here. Stop listening to the news for the last 3 years. much unneeded stress. Yes, yeah, he's a tough dude. Jay Graham over here, tough guy. Yeah, I will say, you know, I don't talk about politics here. I will say that really the majority of the news I watch now is a show on YouTube called Rising, with Crystal and Sagar, who are I guess the premise is she's a liberal and he's a conservative, and they just look at things. They agree on a lot of things, because most Americans actually agree on most things, despite what the TV tells you. And what Jay Burmis tells you, for those of you who found me through Burmis, we're all Americans here. So if you need to get news and don't want to get too angry, they do it in very small segments. So that's how although it can get frustrating, even with reasonable people telling it to you. Thank you, TJ, Nick, Jesse, anyone else watching. Thank you guys for coming. I guess I'll make myself big now, because we've pretty much reached the conclusion of our week in review. So thanks for watching. Again, what I do with these segments, I obviously shoot them as different videos while I'm talking live here, but I do release them all week long, one at a time. So if you want to rewatch it, I release them at usually 7:45 in the morning. Mostly for people who don't have the time to save it for an hour. I love Burmis too. He is a very good friend of mine, but you know, he can get riled up. Yeah. So if you want to check those out, also Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, I either put out Mondays. I've been putting out videos about the First Continental Congress and the delegates to the First Continental Congress. I've done the first two. I'll be doing Rhode Island this Monday. Most of the rest of the week, I either do this, trivia on Fridays. You guys want to play trivia, check out trivia. And yeah, a lot of interviews coming up. So look forward to those with different people from the American Revolution industry, if you would call it that. Cool, thank you. Yes, TJ. Oh, it's way early for you. I mean, 7:45 here. I didn't even think about that. It's like 3 in the morning for you. Whoopsie doodle. Nick, thank you for coming. You guys, thank you so much. I am going to get out of here with my final closing words, which are, I never remember. Round bottom, which I should explain every once in a while. Round bottom is a piece of property that George Washington sold, that one of our favorite viewers, Matt, who's been with us a long time, recommended I sign off with, because it's funny. So, yes. Round bottom, guys. I will be back for trivia